Daniel had been waiting for 20 minutes. He checked his watch again, fingers tapping the white tablecloth, eyes flicking to the door every time it opened. The restaurant was warm, filled with low laughter and the hum of soft jazz, but he felt cold, anxious. "She's late," he murmured under his breath, forcing a smile as the waitress approached. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face when she placed a small red velvet box in front of him instead of a drink. "From your date," she said. His date? No, she wouldn't do something like this. His hands hesitated before opening it, his breath caught in his throat. A locket. Familiar. His fingers traced the delicate chain, the way it gleamed under the restaurant's dim lights. His mind fought against what his eyes were seeing. It was impossible. He had seen this before, held it before, buried it before. The locket should be 6 feet under, and so should she. His phone vibrated against the table. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. She's waiting. The air seemed to shift. The music grew distant, muffled, like it was coming from another room. Daniel's throat felt dry as he turned his head, scanning the restaurant. The couples around him were lost in their own world, sipping wine, whispering over candlelight. No one was watching him. Valentine's Day. The lake stretched out like a frozen mirror, dark cracks threading beneath the surface. The wind bit at his skin, but Daniel barely felt it. His breath was shallow, his hands clenched into fists. Across from him, Lily stood trembling. Her eyes, wide and glassy, reflected nothing but heartbreak. "Say it," she whispered. Daniel looked away, his jaw tightened. "Say it, Daniel." Her voice cracked, raw with desperation. "Tell me the truth." He could still hear the words she had screamed earlier. The accusations, the betrayal in her voice. The way she had searched his face, waiting, hoping for him to deny it. But he didn't. He couldn't. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," he muttered. Lily let out a sharp, hollow laugh. "That's what you have to say?" The wind howled around them. She took a step closer, her red scarf whipping in the wind like a flag of warning. "You lied to me," she said, "for months. You looked me in the eyes and told me I was the only one. Lily, please." "No." Her voice hardened. "Don't you dare beg now." Her hands clenched at her sides. Her eyes glistened, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something final. She shook her head, stepping back toward the frozen edge of the lake. "I loved you, Daniel," she whispered, "and you killed it." Something in him snapped. He reached for her, but she jerked away. The movement was too quick, too unsteady. Her foot slipped. Then, she was gone. A scream tore through the air. Daniel lunged forward, but it was too late. The black water had already swallowed her whole. Her hands clawed at the ice, fingers slipping, nails scratching, eyes wide with panic. She gasped, mouth forming his name. Then, silence. The lake swallowed its secret, and Daniel never spoke of it again. The present slammed back into him like a punch to the chest. Daniel blinked hard, forcing himself back into reality. The restaurant lights were too bright now, the air too warm. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat. He needed to breathe. He needed to shake the memory loose. He picked up his glass, but his fingers trembled too much to hold it steady. Then he saw her. Across the restaurant, at a far table, a woman in a red dress sat with her back turned to him. The dress was too familiar. The way her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders. The way she sat, perfectly still. His phone vibrated. He hesitated before looking down. A message. No name, just words. "Come outside." The night was colder than he expected. The warmth of the restaurant disappeared the moment Daniel stepped outside. He shivered, but it wasn't just from the temperature. His breath curled in front of him in the dim glow of the streetlights. The city was alive. Cars hummed down the street. Laughter echoed from a distant alley, but everything around him felt wrong. The message burned in his mind. He looked down at his phone again. No name, no number. Just the words sitting there, waiting, like an open door he didn't want to walk through. He turned his head, scanning the sidewalk, the curb, the spaces between the parked cars. Nothing. No one. But then he saw them, the footprints. They trailed across the pavement, dark and wet, leading away from the restaurant. Uneven. Hesitant. A single set, as if someone had been standing there, waiting. The prints stretched forward, glistening under the streetlights, heading toward the parking lot. The tracks were fresh. He followed them. His shoes barely made a sound against the pavement. His car was up ahead, parked under a flickering lamp. The footprints led straight to it. He slowed his steps. The driver's side door was open. Just a crack, not wide enough to see inside, but enough to make his pulse jump. He hadn't left it that way. He was sure of it. His throat felt tight as he reached for the handle. The metal was ice beneath his fingers. With one slow pull, the door swung open completely. The first thing he saw was the card. A single, folded Valentine's card sat on the driver's seat. Red, perfect, untouched. He hesitated, then picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it should have. The edges were damp, curling slightly, as if it had been left out in the cold for too long. He turned it over. The words inside were written in looping, delicate script. The ink bled slightly into the paper, as if the writer had pressed too hard. Meet me where we said goodbye. His fingers tightened around the card. He didn't need to think. He didn't need to wonder. He knew exactly where it meant. The lake. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold crawled up his spine, and then he saw it. His reflection stared back at him in the car window, wide-eyed, breath fogging the glass. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, barely a breath away, stood the woman in the red dress. Her face was hidden in the reflection, just an outline against the night. Her dark hair hung motionless. She didn't move, didn't breathe. He spun around. Nothing. The parking lot was empty. The space where she had stood was just air. But the footprints leading to his car? They were gone. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. The headlights cut through the thick dark, but the farther Daniel drove, the more the world around him seemed to shrink. The city had disappeared behind him, swallowed by the night. Out here, there were no streetlights, no buildings, no signs of life, only the road, the trees, and the weight in his chest that grew heavier with every mile. And then, through the fog ahead, it appeared. The lake. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing. He killed the engine. The headlights cast long, jagged shadows across the frozen surface. The ice stretched out, smooth and unbroken, but something about it felt wrong. The air smelled sharp, damp, the kind of cold that sank into your bones. He stepped out. His boots crunched against the frost-covered ground. Fog rolled across the surface of the lake, thick and low, twisting like something alive. The trees stood like blackened skeletons in the distance, silent and watching. He took a breath. This was where it happened. The wind whistled through the trees, but beneath is a whisper. A hum. A sound too soft to be the wind alone. Then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from behind him. His body locked up. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. He didn't turn at first. He couldn't. But the voice, oh God, the voice, made his blood turn to ice. You promised me forever, Daniel. It was soft. Wet. Like water dripping through the cracks of a broken house. His pulse pounded against his ribs. He forced himself to turn. She stood there. Her dress clung to her body, heavy with water. The fabric dripped onto the frozen ground, leaving dark stains where she stood. Her skin, pale, almost blue, stretched too tightly over her bones. And her eyes, hollow, dark, endless. A shadow of the girl he once knew. Of the girl he left beneath the ice. "Lily," he whispered, his voice barely there. She didn't blink. The ice beneath his feet shifted just slightly, just enough for his stomach to drop. He took a step back. A crack split through the silence. The surface shuddered beneath him. Lily tilted her head, a slow, unnatural movement. "Why did you leave me?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The ice creaked louder. Then, before he could move, something wrapped around his ankle. Cold, wet, unforgiving. A hand. Fingers locked tight, dragging, pulling. The ground beneath him gave way, and the lake swallowed him whole. The water filled his lungs, his throat, his veins. Ice wrapped around him, squeezing, pulling him deeper. His screams were nothing but bubbles, swallowed by the dark. Lily's grip never loosened. Her fingers, cold, stiff, unrelenting, dug into his wrist. Her face hovered inches from his, her lips parted, eyes wide, empty. A smile, too soft, curved along her pale mouth. He thrashed, kicked, fought. But the lake had no mercy. The cold burrowed into his bones, numbing, slowing. The last thing he saw before the dark claimed him was her lips moving, shaping words he could no longer hear. The next morning, police found his car first, driver's side open, the seat soaked, as if someone had climbed in dripping wet. No footprints led away. In the distance, a woman in a red dress walked into the mist, and Daniel was never seen again. What do you think happened that night? Was it punishment? A ghost's revenge? Or worse? If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a good scare. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new horror story. See you in the next nightmare.